In the spring of 1943, a German soldier named Werner Müller sat in the dim cargo hold of an American transport ship, watching the Atlantic waves through a small porthole as the vessel churned westward toward an unimaginable destination: the United States of America. Müller had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the chaotic final days of the North African campaign, when German and Italian forces found themselves trapped between advancing Allied armies and the Mediterranean Sea, their supply lines severed, their ammunition dwindling, their options reduced to surrender or annihilation. He was one of nearly 250,000 Axis soldiers who laid down their weapons in Tunisia in May 1943, marking the complete Allied victory in North Africa and creating a massive prisoner population that needed to be housed, fed, and guarded somewhere far from the combat zone. After his capture, Müller spent 10 days in a temporary camp near Tunis, sleeping in tents pitched in a dusty field, eating British and American rations, wondering what would happen next. The guards were professional but distant, processing thousands of prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency, taking names, checking for wounds, separating officers from enlisted men. Then came the announcement that rippled through the camp like an electric shock. Thousands of German prisoners were being shipped to America, to POW camps in the continental United States, across an ocean that German propaganda had declared was under the control of U-boat wolf packs. The news seemed absurd. America was thousands of miles away, across an ocean where German submarines supposedly sank Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. Yet here they were, being loaded onto American ships for a journey that German naval commanders had promised would be impossible for the Allies to sustain. The transport ship carrying Müller and 800 other German prisoners departed from North Africa in early June, joining a larger convoy of merchant vessels carrying supplies, equipment, and troops across the Atlantic. The prisoners were confined to cargo holds that had been hastily converted for human transport, with bunks welded to the walls, buckets for sanitation, and minimal ventilation. The conditions were crowded and uncomfortable, with men packed closely together, the air thick with the smell of bodies and diesel fuel, the holds hot during the day and cold at night. But the treatment was not brutal. Prisoners received 2 meals daily of adequate, if unexciting, food, access to water for drinking and washing, medical attention for those who were sick or injured from their wounds in North Africa. The American guards were professional, maintaining order without excessive force, following what appeared to be strict rules about prisoner treatment. During the 2-week voyage, Müller had plenty of time to think about what awaited him in America. Like most German soldiers, his knowledge of the United States came primarily from Nazi propaganda, which had spent years portraying America as a nation of contradictions and weaknesses. According to the propaganda he had absorbed through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military briefings, America was a plutocracy controlled by Jewish financiers who exploited workers and manipulated a corrupt democratic system for their own profit. German propaganda acknowledged that America had industrial capacity, certainly, but claimed that American production was inefficient and disorganized, hampered by labor unrest, racial conflicts, and the inherent laziness of a people who had grown soft from material comfort. Most importantly, Germans had been told that Americans lacked the martial spirit and discipline of German soldiers, that they would crumble when faced with determined resistance, that they were better at making movies than making war. The propaganda machinery of the Nazi regime had worked systematically to shape German perceptions of America throughout the 1930s and into the war years. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry produced films depicting American cities as cesspools of crime and corruption, where gangsters controlled entire neighborhoods and police were powerless or complicit. German newsreels showed carefully selected footage of American poverty during the Great Depression. Images of breadlines and homeless people living in shanty towns presented as evidence that American capitalism had failed and that American democracy was a sham that left millions in misery. Articles in German newspapers and magazines portrayed American culture as shallow and materialistic, obsessed with money and consumer goods, but lacking the depth and spiritual richness of German culture. American jazz music was denounced as degenerate, American films as mindless entertainment, American literature as commercially driven rather than artistically serious. The racial situation in America received particular attention from German propagandists who used segregation and discrimination against Black Americans as evidence that American claims about democracy and freedom were hypocritical. German propaganda pointed to lynchings, to separate facilities for whites and blacks in the American South, to discrimination in housing and employment as proof that America was fundamentally no different from Germany in its racial policies, except that Germany was at least honest about its beliefs, while America pretended to support equality while practicing discrimination. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It discredited American moral claims to be fighting for freedom and democracy. It suggested that America was internally divided and weak, and it deflected criticism of German racial policies by claiming that America was equally racist. For German soldiers like Müller, who had been exposed to this propaganda for years, the image of America that formed in their minds was of a nation that was powerful in material terms, but morally corrupt, socially divided, and lacking the unity and discipline that characterized Germany. The propaganda about American military capabilities was more complex because it had to acknowledge American industrial strength while minimizing American military effectiveness. German propaganda admitted that America could produce ships, aircraft, tanks, and other equipment in large quantities, but claimed that this equipment was inferior in quality to German weapons. American tanks were portrayed as poorly armored and unreliable, American aircraft as adequate but not exceptional, American ships as mass-produced but vulnerable. The underlying message was that German quality would overcome American quantity, that superior German engineering and the skill of German soldiers would defeat American material advantages. German propaganda also emphasized that Americans were inexperienced in warfare, that they lacked the battle-hardened toughness of German troops who had been fighting since 1939, and that American morale would collapse when they experienced the reality of combat against determined German resistance. Müller discussed these ideas with his fellow prisoners during the long days at sea, in conversations that mixed boredom, anxiety, and intellectual curiosity. Some men firmly believed the propaganda, convinced they were heading to a country barely holding itself together, where they would face harsh treatment from undisciplined guards in poorly organized camps. These pessimists expected to find an America that matched the propaganda image: cities filled with crime and corruption, a population divided by racial hatred, guards who would be brutal because Americans lacked German military professionalism. One corporal from Bavaria insisted that they would likely be put to work in factories under slave labor conditions, forced to produce war materials while being fed minimal rations, because Americans were capitalists who would exploit prisoners for profit just as they exploited their own workers. Another soldier, a former factory worker from the Ruhr, predicted that they would find American cities bombed and damaged from German air raids, conveniently forgetting that German long-range bombing capabilities couldn't reach the American mainland. Other prisoners were more skeptical of the propaganda, pointing out that the Allied soldiers who had defeated them in North Africa had been well-equipped, well-supplied, and competent in combat. The Americans and British hadn't fought like an army on the verge of collapse. They had fought with overwhelming material superiority and tactical competence. The American artillery had been devastating in its accuracy and volume of fire. American supply lines had functioned flawlessly even in the difficult terrain of North Africa. American and British air superiority had been absolute, with Allied aircraft dominating the skies while German air support became increasingly rare. These skeptics wondered if perhaps German propaganda about American weakness had been exaggerated. One sergeant who had fought against American forces in Tunisia spoke with grudging respect about American infantry, saying they had been green and inexperienced at first, but had learned quickly and fought well once they gained experience. Another prisoner noted that the American guards on the ship treated them correctly, following clear rules and procedures which didn't match the image of undisciplined Americans that propaganda had promoted. A few prisoners in the hold had actually visited America before the war, and their perspectives were particularly interesting to Müller. One had been an exchange student at an American university in the late 1930s, studying engineering in Michigan. Another had worked as a merchant seaman in the years before the war, visiting New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and other East Coast ports multiple times. A third had immigrated to America as a child with his parents in the 1920s, lived there for several years before his family returned to Germany in the early 1930s, and still spoke English fluently. These men tried to tell their fellow prisoners that German propaganda was false, that America was far wealthier and more productive than Germany, that American cities were modern and impressive, that Americans had access to consumer goods and food in quantities Germans couldn't imagine. The exchange student described American universities as having facilities and equipment that exceeded anything he had seen in German institutions, with extensive libraries, well-equipped laboratories, and comfortable dormitories. He talked about American students who owned automobiles, who could afford to eat in restaurants regularly, who took for granted a standard of living that would have been considered upper middle class in Germany. He described American supermarkets with aisles full of food, varieties of products that weren't available in Germany even before the war, fresh produce available year-round regardless of season. He mentioned that even working-class American families often owned cars, had indoor plumbing and electricity, lived in houses that would have been considered quite comfortable by German standards. His fellow prisoners listened to these descriptions with skepticism bordering on disbelief. Surely this was exaggeration, or he had been shown only the wealthy parts of America, or he had been deceived by American propaganda during his time at university. The merchant seaman had different stories, but ones that pointed to the same conclusion about American wealth and productivity. He described the port of New York as the most impressive harbor facility he had ever seen, with dozens of piers handling massive volumes of cargo, with equipment and organization that exceeded European ports. He talked about seeing American factories along the waterfronts of industrial cities, facilities that operated around the clock with what seemed like endless supplies of raw materials and energy. He mentioned the American workers he had met, longshoremen and factory workers who earned wages that allowed them to own homes and cars, who seemed to have plenty of food and clothing, who didn't look like an oppressed proletariat despite what German propaganda claimed. He described New York City's skyline with its skyscrapers, the traffic on the streets with more automobiles than he had seen anywhere in Europe, the shops filled with goods, the restaurants crowded with customers. His listeners were skeptical. Surely New York was exceptional. A showcase city that didn't represent the real America. Surely those workers he met were privileged ones, not representative of the exploited masses that propaganda described. The man who had lived in America as a child had the most detailed knowledge, and perhaps for that reason, his testimony was the most disturbing to his fellow prisoners. He described American schools with heated classrooms, with free lunches for students, with textbooks provided at no cost. He talked about American neighborhoods where even modest working-class houses had electricity, indoor plumbing, central heating, refrigerators, and often telephones. He mentioned that American children drank milk daily, that meat was eaten regularly, not just on special occasions, that fresh fruit was common, not rare. He described American hospitals and clinics where medical care was widely available, where diseases like tuberculosis were treated effectively, where infant mortality rates were far lower than in Germany. He spoke about American infrastructure, roads that were paved even in rural areas, bridges that were well maintained, public utilities that functioned reliably. His fellow prisoners found these claims almost impossible to believe. How could ordinary workers afford such things? How could America provide such abundance when Germany, which propaganda portrayed as efficiently organized and productive, struggled to provide adequately for its population even before the war? These men who had experienced America directly faced accusations from their fellow prisoners. The exchange student was told he had been brainwashed by American propaganda during his time at university, that he had been shown a carefully constructed facade designed to impress foreign students, that he had been naive enough to believe what he was told without seeing the poverty and exploitation that lay beneath the surface. The merchant seaman was accused of having seen only the ports and cities, the wealthy areas designed to impress foreigners, without seeing the rural poverty and urban slums that supposedly characterized most of America. The man who had lived in America as a child was told that perhaps his family had been unusually fortunate, or that he was remembering his childhood through rose-colored glasses, or that things in America had gotten much worse during the Depression and the war years. These rationalizations allowed most prisoners to maintain their beliefs about America. despite hearing contradictory testimony from men who had actually been there. Müller listened to these debates without firmly committing to either side, trying to keep an open mind about what he would find. He was educated enough to recognize that propaganda always contained exaggerations and distortions, but he also knew that propaganda usually had some basis in truth, that effective propaganda built on kernels of reality rather than complete fabrications. So perhaps America really did have some of the problems that German propaganda highlighted. Perhaps there really was racial discrimination. Perhaps there really were slums in American cities. Perhaps American workers really did face exploitation from capitalist employers. But perhaps these problems coexisted with genuine wealth and productivity, with a higher standard of living than propaganda admitted, with industrial capabilities that exceeded German expectations. Müller decided he would judge for himself based on what he observed, that he would trust his own eyes and experiences rather than either believing propaganda completely or rejecting it completely. The convoy crossed the Atlantic without incident, despite German claims that U-boats controlled these waters and could interdict Allied shipping at will. Müller never saw a submarine, never heard depth charges exploding in the distance, never experienced the terror of a torpedo attack. The crossing was monotonous but safe, suggesting that perhaps German naval power in the Atlantic wasn't as dominant as propaganda claimed. The wolf-pack tactics that had been so effective in the early years of the war seemed to have been countered by improved Allied convoy procedures, better anti-submarine technology, and the breaking of German naval codes that allowed Allied forces to route convoys around known U-boat positions. For Müller and his fellow prisoners, the safe Atlantic crossing was their first concrete evidence that German propaganda might have overstated German capabilities while understating Allied strengths. If Germany really controlled the Atlantic, how were the Allies moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the ocean without losses? When the ship finally approached the American coast after 2 weeks at sea, prisoners were allowed on deck in small groups to see land and to get fresh air after the confinement of the holds. Müller emerged from below into bright sunshine and saw the coastline of America for the first time, a hazy line of land on the horizon, gradually resolving into details as the ship drew closer. What struck him immediately was the amount of shipping. The waters near the coast were filled with vessels, merchant ships, tankers, naval escorts, tugboats, ferries, all moving with apparent purpose and organization. The sea lanes were clearly well established and heavily trafficked, with ships arriving and departing in steady streams. This was not a nation struggling to maintain its supply lines across a contested ocean. This was a nation moving supplies and materials with industrial efficiency, treating the Atlantic as a highway rather than a battlefield. As the ship moved closer to shore, more details became visible. Müller could see port facilities extending along the coast, with cranes and warehouses with piers jutting into the water, with ships docked side by side being loaded and unloaded simultaneously. The scale of the port operations was impressive even from a distance. Through binoculars that prisoners passed around, Müller could see trucks moving along the docks, trains waiting on tracks parallel to the waterfront, cargo being transferred from ships to land transport with what appeared to be smooth coordination. He had seen German ports before the war and during the early years of the war, and he had seen British and French ports during military operations. The American port facilities visible from the ship appeared larger and busier than any European port he had encountered. The sheer volume of activity suggested industrial and logistical capabilities that exceeded what he had expected. The transport ship entered the harbor in the early afternoon, guided by a pilot boat that came out to meet them beyond the breakwater. As the ship moved slowly through the harbor toward its designated pier, Müller and the other prisoners crowded along the rail to get their first close look at America. The harbor was enormous, far larger than the port facilities Müller had seen in Hamburg or any other European city. Dozens of ships were docked at various piers, with cargo operations proceeding simultaneously at multiple locations. Cranes swung loads from ships to docks and from docks to waiting trucks and rail cars. Forklifts moved pallets of supplies. Workers in various uniforms and civilian clothes moved with purposeful efficiency, executing what appeared to be well-rehearsed procedures for handling the constant flow of material coming and going from the port. What impressed Müller most was not just the scale, but the apparent organization and efficiency of the operations. There was no visible chaos, no sense of desperation or confusion. Workers moved systematically, each apparently knowing their role and executing it competently. Equipment appeared to be in good condition, well maintained rather than jury-rigged or improvised. The cranes operated smoothly without breaking down. The trucks waiting to receive cargo looked new, or at least well maintained, not the collection of aging vehicles held together with spare parts that characterized German logistics in the later stages of the North African campaign. Everything Müller observed suggested an industrial system that was functioning well, that had adequate resources, that was organized competently, that was producing and moving material in quantities that matched or exceeded what German propaganda had acknowledged about American industrial capacity. As the ship approached its assigned pier, Müller noticed the American workers more closely. The longshoremen unloading ships and the military personnel supervising operations all appeared well-fed and healthy. This observation struck Müller immediately because he and his fellow prisoners had spent months on reduced rations in North Africa, where German supply lines had been stretched thin and where food had been one of many critical shortages. The prisoners were thin, their uniforms hanging loosely on frames that had lost weight during the campaign and the weeks after capture. The Americans they could see from the ship's rail looked like people who had never missed a meal, who had never experienced the gnawing hunger that became routine for German soldiers when supplies ran short. The contrast was striking and disconcerting. These were people from a nation supposedly at war, engaged in a global conflict on multiple continents and oceans, yet they looked prosperous and well-nourished. The prisoners watched one longshoreman take a break from his work, sit down on a crate, and pull out what appeared to be a substantial sandwich wrapped in paper, along with an apple and a thermos that presumably contained coffee or another beverage. The man ate his lunch unhurriedly, clearly not worried about when his next meal would come or whether there would be enough food. This casual abundance, this taking for granted of adequate food, stood in sharp contrast to the situation in Germany, where rationing had been in effect since the start of the war and where rations had been repeatedly reduced as the war continued. Müller tried to remember when he had last eaten a meal without thinking about whether there would be another meal later, when he had last had enough food to feel truly satisfied rather than just adequately fed, and he couldn't recall any recent occasion. The longshoreman finished his sandwich, threw the wrapper in a trash bin, and returned to work, having consumed casually what would have been a substantial meal by German military standards. The ship docked, and sailors secured it to the pier with heavy ropes while the gangplank was positioned. American military police came aboard first, conferring with the ship's officers and organizing the procedures for disembarking the prisoners. The MPs were professional in their demeanor, carrying their weapons casually but alertly, showing no particular hostility toward the prisoners, but also no friendliness, maintaining the neutral professionalism of guards dealing with captives who posed no immediate threat. Orders were given in English, then translated by a German-speaking American officer who appeared to be of German ancestry based on his accent when speaking German. The prisoners were to form up in ranks on deck, then march down the gangplank in organized groups, then form up again on the pier for transport to their ultimate destination. Müller and his fellow prisoners formed ranks on the deck, standing at attention out of habit and military discipline, even though they were now prisoners rather than soldiers. German military training emphasized discipline and order, and these habits persisted even in captivity. The prisoners stood straight, waiting for orders, while American guards positioned themselves at intervals along the route the prisoners would take from ship to shore. When the order came to begin disembarkation, the prisoners marched down the gangplank in orderly columns, their boots echoing on the metal surface, descending from the ship to American soil for the first time. Müller felt a strange mixture of emotions as his feet touched the pier: relief to be off the ship after 2 weeks at sea, curiosity about what came next, apprehension about the unknown future, and a persistent sense of unreality that he was standing on American ground thousands of miles from the war. The prisoners formed up on the pier in neat ranks while American guards counted them and checked names against rosters. The process took perhaps 20 minutes, during which Müller had opportunity to observe the port operations continuing around them. A freighter at the next pier was being unloaded, its holds yielding what appeared to be military vehicles, trucks, jeeps, possibly some light armored vehicles, all painted in military olive drab. A crane lifted the vehicles from the hold and lowered them to the pier where American soldiers drove them away toward a staging area. The vehicles looked new, fresh from factories, not rebuilt or repaired equipment, but new production. Müller watched a steady stream of vehicles emerge from the ship's hold, one after another, and tried to estimate how many were being unloaded. Dozens certainly, perhaps over 100 from this one ship, and there were dozens of ships in this harbor. The rate of production and the logistics required to manufacture, ship, and distribute this equipment suggested industrial capabilities that were formidable. At another pier, a tanker was being unloaded, presumably delivering fuel oil for military or civilian use. The fuel flowed through thick hoses from ship-to-shore storage tanks, and Müller wondered about the petroleum logistics that allowed America to fuel its military forces, its industrial production, and its civilian economy simultaneously. Germany had struggled with oil shortages throughout the war, with synthetic fuel production never quite meeting needs, and with access to petroleum imports restricted by Allied naval power. Yet here was America, apparently with adequate fuel supplies to meet all demands, able to operate vast numbers of vehicles and aircraft and ships without crippling shortages. The oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma, which German intelligence had noted, but which propaganda had minimized in importance, apparently produced in quantities that made oil shortages a non-issue for the American war effort. The prisoners were ordered to march, and columns of German soldiers moved away from the pier into the port facility proper. They marched in formation along paved roads that ran between warehouses and storage yards, passing American military and civilian workers who paused in their tasks to watch the prisoners go by. The reactions of American workers varied. Some stared with open curiosity, seeing enemy soldiers on American soil for perhaps the first time, studying the German uniforms and trying to match faces to the propaganda images of fanatical Nazis. Others glanced briefly and then returned to their work, apparently not particularly interested in prisoners who posed no threat. A few workers showed expressions that might have been sympathy or pity, seeing thin men in worn uniforms who looked tired and defeated, though these sympathetic expressions were rare compared to the neutral curiosity that characterized most reactions. Müller noticed that the American workers, both military and civilian, appeared well clothed in garments that looked new or at least well maintained. The military uniforms were clean and in good repair, properly fitted, showing none of the improvised modifications or worn patches that had become common in German units as the war progressed and supply systems deteriorated. The civilian workers wore work clothes that appeared sturdy and functional, not threadbare or repeatedly mended. Some workers wore leather boots that looked new, and Müller thought about his own boots, which had been resoled twice and which showed cracks in the leather that he had been unable to prevent despite regular applications of dubbin when it was available. The material standard visible even among manual laborers in an American port suggested that shortages and rationing, if they existed in America at all, were far less severe than what Germans had experienced. The prisoners marched through the port facility for perhaps 15 minutes, giving Müller ample opportunity to observe his surroundings. The warehouses were substantial structures, well maintained, with roofs that showed no obvious damage or disrepair. The roads were paved with asphalt or concrete, smooth and well maintained, designed to handle heavy truck traffic without deteriorating. Electric lights on poles illuminated the roads and work areas, suggesting that electricity was abundant enough to be used generously for utilitarian purposes rather than rationed carefully as it was in Germany. Telephone lines ran along the roads, connecting various buildings and facilities, indicating a communications infrastructure that was extensive and presumably reliable. Everything about the physical infrastructure of the port suggested investment and maintenance. An industrial system that had resources to build properly and to maintain what had been built. The prisoners were halted near the edge of the port facility where a train waited on tracks that ran parallel to the waterfront. The train consisted of passenger cars, older equipment no longer used for premium civilian service, but still far more comfortable than the freight cars that German military authorities typically used for troop transport. The cars had windows, seats, aisles, and presumably toilet facilities, offering accommodations that exceeded what most German soldiers had experienced during military movements. American guards directed prisoners toward the train, assigning them to specific cars, maintaining order and accountability while treating the prisoners with professional correctness rather than hostility or brutality. Müller climbed the steps into his assigned car, found a seat next to a window, and settled in for whatever journey lay ahead. As more prisoners boarded the train and found seats, Müller examined the passenger car's interior more closely. The seats were upholstered, somewhat worn but still functional, arranged in rows facing forward with an aisle down the center. The windows were large, offering good views of the passing landscape, though they were fitted with screens that could be lowered to prevent anyone from climbing out. The ceiling had electric lights that provided adequate illumination. At each end of the car were toilet facilities, cramped but functional. The car had clearly seen years of use and was no longer in pristine condition, but it was maintained and serviceable, vastly more comfortable than the bare freight cars or cattle cars that Müller had experienced during military service. The very fact that America was using passenger cars to transport prisoners suggested either that they had so much rolling stock that they could afford to use older passenger equipment for this purpose, or that they considered even prisoners worthy of reasonably humane transport conditions. Or both. The train remained stationary for perhaps 30 minutes, while all the prisoners from the ship were loaded and accounted for. During this time, American guards moved through the cars, counting prisoners, checking that everyone was seated, answering questions from prisoners who spoke English, or who found guards who spoke German. The guards explained that the journey to the prisoner of war camp would take approximately 12 hours with several stops along the way, that food would be provided during the journey, that prisoners should remain seated except when using the toilet facilities, and that anyone attempting to escape would be shot. The tone was matter-of-fact rather than threatening, the guards simply explaining the rules and expectations without drama. One guard, a sergeant who spoke fluent German with a Bavarian accent and who was clearly of German heritage, engaged in brief conversation with prisoners, asking where they were from in Germany, expressing sympathy that they had ended up as prisoners, and assuring them that they would be treated fairly in accordance with international agreements. The train finally departed the port area with a jerk and a clatter, the cars coupling engaging, and the locomotive beginning to pull its load away from the coast toward the interior of the country. Müller and his fellow prisoners pressed against the windows, eager to see America, to observe the landscape and cities of the enemy nation that would be their home for the duration of their captivity. The train initially moved through industrial areas near the port, passing warehouses, factories, rail yards, and other facilities associated with maritime commerce and manufacturing. The industrial district appeared active and productive, with smoke rising from factory chimneys, trucks moving along streets, workers visible in yards and loading docks. This was not a nation with idle factories and unemployed workers, as German propaganda had sometimes suggested. This was a nation with its industrial capacity operating at high intensity. As the train moved away from the waterfront, it passed through residential neighborhoods that bordered the industrial areas. These were working-class neighborhoods, the homes of factory workers and longshoremen and other industrial laborers, and Müller studied them carefully because they would reveal how ordinary Americans lived. The houses were modest, mostly wood-frame construction, 2 stories tall with small yards front and back. But even these modest working-class houses appeared well-maintained, with painted exteriors that weren't peeling, with roofs in good repair, with windows intact. Many houses had porches where people sat in the afternoon warmth. Some yards had gardens where residents grew vegetables to supplement their food supply, suggesting that rationing might exist in America, though perhaps not as severely as in Germany. Children played in yards and streets, and Müller noticed that the children looked healthy and well-fed. Not the thin, malnourished children that had become increasingly common in German cities as the war progressed and food supplies diminished. The train passed a school, a substantial brick building 3 stories tall with large windows and a playground with equipment for children. School was apparently not in session, as the building appeared empty and the playground deserted. But the facility itself was impressive, far larger and better equipped than the village school Müller had attended as a child in rural Bavaria. The school's existence and scale suggested that America invested substantially in education, that public schools were well funded and designed to accommodate large numbers of students in reasonable comfort. Müller thought about German schools, which were adequate but often crowded and minimally equipped, and wondered about the implications of an educational system that appeared to provide superior facilities even in working-class neighborhoods of American cities. The train continued through the city, and the neighborhoods gradually shifted from working-class to middle-class areas. The houses became larger, set on bigger lots, with more elaborate landscaping and architectural details. These middle-class neighborhoods appeared prosperous, with houses that would have been considered quite comfortable by German standards occupied apparently by ordinary American families. Automobiles were parked in driveways or along streets, not just a few cars belonging to wealthy families, but numerous vehicles suggesting that automobile ownership was common among the middle class. Müller counted cars as the train passed, trying to estimate what percentage of families owned vehicles, and concluded that perhaps half or more of the houses had at least one car visible. This casual, widespread automobile ownership contrasted sharply with Germany, where car ownership had been largely restricted to the wealthy and where most people relied on bicycles and public transportation. The train passed a shopping district in the middle-class neighborhood, a street lined with stores and businesses serving the residential areas around it. Through the windows, Müller could see shops that appeared to be open and operating normally. A grocery store, a bakery, a drugstore, a clothing store, a hardware store, various other retail establishments. People walked along the sidewalks carrying shopping bags, going about their daily business apparently without significant disruption from the war. The shops had display windows showing merchandise, suggesting that goods were available for purchase despite wartime conditions. Müller tried to compare this scene with shopping districts in German cities, which by 1943 had become much less vibrant as consumer goods became scarce, as stores closed due to lack of inventory, and as shopping increasingly meant standing in queues hoping that rationed goods would be available. The American shopping district suggested an economy that was still functioning relatively normally despite the war. As the train left the city and entered suburban and then rural areas, Müller's attention shifted to the landscape and agricultural regions. The countryside appeared prosperous and well-maintained, with substantial farmhouses, large barns, and extensive fields. The farms were clearly productive, with crops growing in neat rows, with livestock visible in pastures, with equipment and infrastructure suggesting successful agricultural operations. What struck Müller most forcefully was the extent of mechanization visible on American farms. He saw tractors in fields, not just one or two, but multiple tractors, suggesting that mechanized farming was standard rather than exceptional. He saw other farm machinery, combines for harvesting grain, mechanical planters, hay balers, equipment that replaced manual labor with machine power and that allowed smaller numbers of workers to farm much larger areas. German agriculture, even before the war, had been less mechanized than American farming, relying more heavily on animal power and manual labor. German farms used horses extensively for plowing and transport, supplemented by tractors in some regions, but with mechanization far from universal. The wartime loss of farm workers to military service and to factory work had created labor shortages in German agriculture that mechanization might have addressed but couldn't because tractor production was diverted to military purposes. Looking at American farms from the train window, Müller saw an agricultural system that had mechanized extensively before the war and that apparently continued to produce abundantly despite wartime demands on industry and manpower. The implications were sobering. America could feed its civilian population, provision its military forces, and export food to allies, all while maintaining agricultural productivity that exceeded German capabilities. The farmhouses themselves were revealing. They were substantial structures, usually 2 stories tall, built of wood or brick, with multiple rooms and modern conveniences visible from outside. Many farmhouses had electric lines running to them, indicating that rural electrification had reached even isolated agricultural areas. Some houses had windmills or water towers nearby, suggesting systems for providing running water. Barns were large and well constructed, designed to house equipment and livestock efficiently. The overall impression was of farms that were prosperous businesses rather than subsistence operations. of farmers who lived comfortably rather than barely scraping by. Müller came from a rural area in Bavaria, and his family knew farm families who worked hard and lived modestly, constantly struggling with debts and weather and markets. American farms appeared to operate at a different scale and level of prosperity. The train made its first stop in a small town about 3 hours into the journey. The prisoners were allowed to disembark under guard, to stretch their legs and use toilet facilities in the train station while the locomotive took on water and coal. The town appeared typical of small American towns, a main street with shops and businesses, a town square with a courthouse or civic building, residential streets extending outward from the commercial center, churches with steeples visible above the trees. The architecture was different from European towns, with more wood construction and less stone or brick, with wider streets designed for automobile traffic, with a more spread-out layout reflecting cheaper land and different planning traditions. But the town appeared prosperous and well-maintained, with paved streets, electric lights, telephone wires connecting buildings, and shops that appeared to be operating normally. American civilians in the town stopped to stare at the prisoners standing on the train platform under guard. The reactions were mixed and revealing. Some civilians stared with open hostility, seeing enemy soldiers who represented the nation their sons and husbands were fighting overseas. A few women glared at the prisoners with anger that was palpable and understandable, perhaps having lost family members in the war and blaming all Germans for their losses. Other civilians showed curiosity without obvious hostility, studying the German uniforms and equipment, trying to understand who these men were and what had brought them to a small American town. A few civilians, particularly older people, showed what appeared to be sympathy or pity, seeing young men who were far from home and defeated, recognizing a common humanity despite the politics and conflicts that had made them enemies. One elderly woman approached the guards and asked if she could give the prisoners some food. The guards were uncertain how to respond, checking with their officer who consulted briefly with the train conductor before deciding to allow it. The woman returned a few minutes later with a basket containing sandwiches and apples, which she handed to prisoners nearest her before the guards gently but firmly moved her back. Her gesture was brief but meaningful, an act of humanity that transcended national boundaries, an elderly woman seeing hungry young men and responding with the instinct to feed them. Several prisoners thanked her in halting English, and she nodded and smiled before walking away. Müller received one of her apples and ate it slowly, savoring the fresh fruit which he hadn't tasted in months. The apple was crisp and sweet, obviously fresh and of good quality, another small piece of evidence about American agricultural productivity and about the food available even in small towns far from major cities. The train resumed its journey after perhaps 30 minutes. Continuing through rural landscapes and small towns, Müller noticed that the roads visible from the train were generally paved, even secondary roads in rural areas, suggesting an infrastructure investment that exceeded what existed in rural Germany. Telephone and electric lines ran alongside roads, reaching farms and small towns that would have lacked such services in many parts of Europe. Bridges over rivers and streams appeared well constructed and maintained, not the improvised or deteriorating structures that had become common in Germany as resources were diverted to military purposes. The accumulated effect of these observations was the growing realization that American infrastructure was more extensive and better maintained than German infrastructure, that America had invested systematically in roads, bridges, utilities, and communications in ways that supported both economic productivity and quality of life. As afternoon turned to evening, the train continued inland, passing through regions that became less populated and more agricultural. Müller watched the sun set over American farmland, seeing fields extending to the horizon, seeing farmhouses with lights coming on as darkness fell, seeing a landscape that appeared peaceful and productive despite the global war in which America was engaged. The contrast between this peaceful countryside and the battlefields of North Africa, where he had fought just weeks earlier, was jarring. The war seemed very distant from this place, seemed almost unreal in the context of these prosperous farms and quiet towns. Yet Müller knew that this peaceful countryside was the foundation of American military power, that these farms and factories and infrastructure were producing the food, equipment, and supplies that sustained American military forces across the globe, and that supplied American allies as well. Dinner was provided on the train as evening progressed, and this meal offered Müller and his fellow prisoners another revelation about American abundance. American guards distributed paper bags to each prisoner, and when Müller opened his bag, he found a meal that exceeded his expectations. 2 thick sandwiches with what appeared to be ham and cheese, a hard-boiled egg, an orange, a chocolate bar, and a small carton of milk. The quantity and quality of food provided for a simple travel meal astonished the prisoners, who passed around comments and observations in German while they ate. The sandwiches were substantial, made with soft white bread that was fresh, with generous portions of meat and cheese. The orange was a luxury that most German soldiers hadn't seen in months or years, citrus fruit having become essentially unavailable in Germany due to wartime disruptions of Mediterranean trade. The chocolate was commercial quality, not the inferior substitute chocolate that German civilians received in their rations. The milk was cold, apparently having been stored in ice until distribution. Müller ate slowly, wanting to savor the meal and also wanting to make it last because he wasn't certain when the next food would come. The habit of food insecurity, developed over months of inadequate rations during the North African campaign, persisted even in the face of apparent American abundance. He ate one sandwich completely, wrapped the second sandwich carefully in the paper bag to save for later, ate the egg and the orange, and carefully stored the chocolate bar in his pocket as a reserve against future hunger. Other prisoners adopted similar strategies, eating part of the meal and saving part for later, the hoarding instinct overriding the evidence before them that food in America might be more reliably available than what they had experienced in German military service. One prisoner, a corporal named Friedrich, who had been a schoolteacher before the war and who spoke some English, asked one of the guards about the food. The guard, a young private who seemed friendly and willing to talk, explained that this was standard travel rations provided by the US Army for troop movements, nothing special or unusual, just the normal meal that would be provided to American soldiers traveling by train. Friedrich translated this information for his fellow prisoners, and they discussed the implications. If this was standard, routine food for troop movements, then American soldiers regularly ate better than German soldiers had eaten even before the war. The comparison was uncomfortable and raised questions about German propaganda claims that American soldiers were poorly supplied and inadequately fed compared to well-provisioned German forces. The train continued through the night, with most prisoners trying to sleep in their seats as best they could. Müller dozed fitfully, waking periodically when the train stopped at small stations or slowed for curves, looking out the window at the darkness of the American countryside. Occasionally, he saw lights from isolated farmhouses or from small towns the train passed through without stopping. The electric lights, visible even in remote rural areas, suggested an electrification of the countryside that was more extensive than in Germany. Even as late as the 1930s, many rural areas in Germany lacked electricity, with farmers relying on kerosene lamps and candles for lighting. The widespread rural electrification visible in America represented infrastructure investment on a massive scale, reflecting both government programs and economic development that had brought modern utilities even to isolated agricultural regions. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the train windows, and prisoners woke stiff and uncomfortable from sleeping in seats, but rested enough to be alert and curious about their surroundings. The landscape had changed during the night, becoming flatter and more expansive, with larger fields and fewer trees than the regions they had passed through the previous day. This was farmland on a grand scale, with individual fields that extended for what appeared to be miles, with mechanized farming equipment visible even in the early morning as farmers began their workday. The sheer scale of American agriculture was becoming apparent. Not small farms of a few dozen acres worked intensively by families, but large operations of hundreds or thousands of acres worked extensively with machinery, producing grain and other crops in quantities that could feed not just local populations, but distant cities and foreign nations. Breakfast was provided shortly after dawn, again distributed in paper bags by American guards who moved through the train cars handing out meals. This morning, meal was simpler than the previous evening's dinner, but still substantial. More sandwiches, these containing eggs and bacon, along with an apple and a small bottle of juice. Müller ate without saving any for later this time, beginning to trust that food would continue to be provided regularly, that American abundance might be reliable rather than temporary. The bacon in his sandwich was a particular luxury. Pork having become increasingly scarce in Germany as the war progressed and as livestock was slaughtered faster than they could be replaced due to feed shortages. The casual inclusion of bacon in a routine military meal suggested that meat rationing in America, if it existed at all, was far less severe than in Germany. The train arrived at its destination in mid-morning, pulling into a small rural station that appeared to serve primarily freight traffic and occasional passenger service. The prisoners were ordered to gather their minimal belongings and prepare to disembark. They filed out of the cars in organized groups, forming up on the platform under the supervision of American guards who had made this routine trip multiple times before and who executed the prisoner transfer with professional efficiency. A convoy of trucks waited near the station, military vehicles with canvas covers over the cargo beds, ready to transport the prisoners on the final leg of their journey to the POW camp. The trucks were in good condition, relatively new, painted in standard military olive drab, another example of American production capacity and of the equipment available even for routine transport tasks. The prisoners climbed into the trucks, sitting on benches along the sides of the cargo beds, and the convoy departed the station, heading down a paved highway into the countryside. The drive took approximately 45 minutes, following roads that were well maintained and that passed through agricultural regions that continued to display the prosperity and mechanization Müller had observed from the train. The convoy eventually turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that led to a complex of buildings and fences visible in the distance. This was the prisoner of war camp, located in an isolated rural area far from major cities or strategic installations, positioned where escape would be difficult and where the presence of German prisoners would have minimal impact on American civilian populations. The POW camp sprawled across perhaps 100 acres, surrounded by double barbed wire fences approximately 12 feet tall, with guard towers positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter. The design was clearly intended to prevent escape. The fences were too high to climb easily, the guard towers provided overlapping fields of observation and fire, the cleared ground between the fences and the nearest buildings eliminated hiding places, and the camp's location in flat open countryside meant that anyone who did manage to escape would be visible for miles while trying to reach any significant cover. Despite these security measures, the camp didn't look brutal or oppressive. The buildings were new or recently constructed, following standardized designs that American military authorities used for various temporary installations. The barracks were long rectangular structures with pitched roofs, raised slightly off the ground, with windows along the sides providing light and ventilation. The trucks passed through the main gate after guards checked documentation and counted prisoners, then proceeded to an administration building where the new arrivals would be processed and assigned to barracks. Müller and his fellow prisoners climbed out of the trucks and formed up in ranks, waiting while American officers conferred and organized the intake procedures. During this wait, Müller had opportunity to observe prisoners who had already been at the camp for some time, men who had been captured earlier and who had adapted to captivity in America. These established prisoners moved around the camp with what appeared to be reasonable freedom within the wire, walking between buildings, sitting in groups talking, playing cards or other games, engaged in various activities that suggested life in the camp involved considerable free time and few restrictions beyond the fundamental fact of confinement. What struck Müller immediately about the established prisoners was that they looked healthier than when they had been captured. German soldiers captured in North Africa had been thin and worn from months of inadequate rations and the physical demands of desert warfare. The prisoners Müller observed in the camp had filled out, had gained weight, had lost the gaunt appearance that characterized men who had been on short rations for extended periods. Their uniforms, the same German military uniforms they had worn when captured, now fit more snugly than they had in North Africa, stretched across broader shoulders and fuller torsos. The prisoners looked like men who had been eating well for weeks or months, who had recovered from malnutrition and who had regained healthy body weight. The transformation was visible and undeniable. Captivity in America had been physically beneficial for these men. The intake process began with German prisoners being called forward individually or in small groups to be registered, searched, interviewed, and assigned to quarters. Müller waited his turn, watching as prisoners ahead of him were processed efficiently by American administrative personnel who filled out forms, took photographs, recorded information, and explained camp rules through translators or through German-speaking American officers. When Müller's turn came, he approached the desk where an American captain sat with a German-speaking sergeant beside him to translate. The captain asked basic questions: name, rank, unit, place, and date of capture, any medical conditions requiring attention, any special skills or training that might be relevant to work assignments. Müller answered honestly, providing the information required by Geneva Convention protocols while declining to provide any military intelligence beyond what the conventions mandated. The American captain explained the camp rules in English while the German-speaking sergeant translated. Prisoners were expected to obey orders from American guards and camp administrators. Escape attempts would result in punishment, including possible time in isolation, though the captain noted that escape from this location would be pointless given the distances to neutral territory and the impossibility of reaching Mexico or Canada without being recaptured. Prisoners would be assigned to barracks with other enlisted men, with German officers housed separately in accordance with Geneva Convention requirements that officers not be required to work and that they be housed separately from enlisted men. Daily routines would include roll calls, meals at specified times, work assignments for those who volunteered or who were assigned to tasks permitted under international law, and free time for recreation and personal activities. Medical care would be provided for anyone who became sick or injured. Mail service would be available, allowing prisoners to send and receive letters through Red Cross channels, though correspondence would be censored to prevent transmission of military intelligence. The explanation of mail procedures caught Müller's attention because he desperately wanted to contact his family to let them know he had survived being captured and was safe in an American POW camp. The captain explained that prisoners could write letters on standardized forms that would be provided, that these letters would be reviewed by American censors to ensure they contained no military information or prohibited content, and that approved letters would be forwarded through the International Red Cross to Germany, where they would be delivered if postal services were still functioning in the recipient's area. The process would be slow, with letters potentially taking months to reach Germany, but it offered at least the possibility of communication with family. Similarly, prisoners could receive letters from family members, again routed through Red Cross channels and subject to censorship by both American and German authorities. After completing the administrative processing, Müller was issued additional items: a blanket, a towel, a bar of soap, eating utensils, and a tin cup. These items were standard issue for all prisoners and represented basic necessities for daily life in the camp. The quality of even these simple items was notable. The blanket was thick wool, clean and in good condition, not threadbare or infested with lice as military blankets often became after extended use. The soap was commercial quality rather than the harsh ersatz soap that had become standard in Germany. The eating utensils were sturdy metal rather than improvised or makeshift equipment. With these items in hand, Müller was directed to his assigned barracks by a guard who walked with him across the camp compound. The barracks building was approximately 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, a wooden structure raised slightly off the ground with steps leading up to doors at each end. Inside, the barracks was divided into a large open bay with rows of bunk beds along each side and a central aisle down the middle. Each bunk had a thin mattress, a pillow, and space underneath for storing personal belongings. Windows along both sides of the building provided natural light and ventilation, with screens to keep out insects. The building had electric lights hanging from the ceiling, allowing illumination after dark. At one end of the barracks was a small room containing sinks and toilets, basic sanitation facilities that were shared by all the barracks occupants. The overall impression was of simple but adequate accommodations, military barracks that were neither luxurious nor harsh, functional housing designed to shelter large numbers of men efficiently. Müller found an unclaimed lower bunk, stowed his issued items, and sat down to rest and process the overwhelming experiences of the past 24 hours. Other new arrivals were similarly settling into the barracks, claiming bunks, arranging their minimal possessions, beginning to adapt to their new environment. Prisoners who had been in the camp longer approached the newcomers with curiosity and with offers of information and advice. One prisoner, a private named Klaus, who had been captured several months earlier and who had been at this camp since its opening, sat down on the bunk across from Müller and began answering questions before they were even asked. Klaus explained the daily routine in the camp. Reveille was at 6 in the morning, with prisoners expected to be out of bunks and ready for roll call by 6:30. After roll call, breakfast was served in the mess hall from 7 to 8. Work assignments, for those who had them, began at 8:30 and continued until noon with a break for lunch. Afternoon work continued from 1 until 5, followed by dinner from 5:30 until 7. Evenings were free time, with prisoners allowed to pursue various activities until lights out at 10. Roll call was repeated each evening at 9 to ensure all prisoners were accounted for. The routine was structured but not oppressive, providing clear expectations and enough free time for prisoners to maintain some sense of autonomy and dignity. The food situation, Klaus explained with evident satisfaction, was extraordinary. The camp kitchen served 3 substantial meals daily, with quantities and variety that exceeded anything German soldiers had received even in peacetime. Breakfast typically included bread, eggs or porridge, meat such as bacon or sausage, coffee or milk, and sometimes fruit or pastries. Lunch was the main meal, with meat, potatoes or other starches, vegetables, bread and dessert. Dinner was lighter but still substantial, perhaps soup with bread and meat, or sandwiches with sides, and always adequate to satisfy hunger. The portions were generous, with prisoners allowed to take seconds if food remained after everyone had been served once. The quality was good, with fresh ingredients rather than preserved or dehydrated food, with meals that were properly cooked and seasoned. Klaus had gained perhaps 20 pounds since arriving at the camp, and he credited the steady availability of good food for his recovery from the malnutrition that had afflicted him in North Africa. Müller listened to this description with skepticism that must have shown on his face because Klaus laughed and said that everyone reacted the same way at first, that new arrivals never believed the food situation until they experienced it personally, that German soldiers couldn't imagine prison food being better than military rations. Klaus suggested that Müller would understand after his first meal, that seeing and eating would convince him more effectively than any description. Other prisoners nearby confirmed Klaus's account, adding their own observations about the food quality and quantity, about the medical care available, about the treatment by American guards, about the various aspects of camp life that contradicted German propaganda about American brutality and inefficiency. The consensus among established prisoners was that captivity in America was far preferable to continued service in the German military under the conditions that existed in 1943, that they were safer, healthier, and better fed as prisoners than they had been as soldiers. The noon meal provided Müller's first opportunity to experience the camp food situation directly. A bell rang at 12 o'clock, and prisoners began moving toward the mess hall, a large building near the center of the camp compound. Müller followed Klaus and other prisoners from his barracks, joining the flow of men converging on the mess hall from various directions. The prisoners lined up outside the building in reasonably orderly fashion, without the desperate pushing and shoving that characterized food lines when rations were scarce, suggesting that the prisoners trusted food would be available in adequate quantities and that rushing was unnecessary. When the doors opened, the line moved steadily into the building, where prisoners picked up trays and utensils before proceeding along a serving line. The serving line operated cafeteria style, with American cooks and German prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, serving food from large pots and pans onto the trays of prisoners passing through. Müller watched as the server placed a substantial piece of roasted chicken on his tray, followed by a large scoop of mashed potatoes with gravy, a serving of green beans, 2 slices of bread with butter, and a piece of cake for dessert. The portions were larger than he had expected. The food looked and smelled appealing, and the casual abundance was disorienting for someone accustomed to carefully rationed meals. Müller carried his tray to a long table where Klaus and other prisoners from his barracks were already seated and eating. The first bite of chicken confirmed that the food quality matched its appearance. The meat was properly cooked, tender and flavorful, seasoned adequately if simply. The mashed potatoes were real potatoes, not ersatz or substitute ingredients, with real butter and milk making them rich and satisfying. The green beans were cooked, but still had texture, not boiled to mushiness, served with a pat of butter that melted into them. The bread was soft and fresh, the butter yellow and creamy, the cake sweet and moist. Müller ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling his stomach fill for the first time in longer than he could remember. The sensation of satiety, of having eaten enough to feel satisfied rather than just adequately fed, was almost forgotten, and its return was profoundly comforting. Around him, other prisoners ate with varying degrees of enthusiasm and sophistication. New arrivals like Müller ate carefully, almost reverently, still unable to quite believe the food was real and would continue to be available. Established prisoners ate more casually, taking the good food for granted as routine rather than exceptional, having adapted to American abundance during their months in captivity. Some prisoners went back for seconds, taking advantage of the policy that allowed additional servings if food remained after everyone had eaten once. Conversations around the tables were animated, with prisoners discussing news from letters received, speculating about the progress of the war, sharing information about families and homes in Germany, maintaining social connections that helped preserve morale and mental health during the long months of captivity. After the meal, prisoners had time before afternoon activities to rest or to explore the camp. Müller walked around the compound with Klaus, who acted as guide and explained the various facilities and features of the camp. The medical clinic was housed in a separate building near the administration area, staffed by American military doctors and medics who treated prisoners for illness and injuries. Klaus explained that the medical care was excellent, far better than what German soldiers had received even before the war, with access to medications including antibiotics that were scarce in Germany. Prisoners who became seriously ill or who required surgery were transported to American military hospitals, where they received treatment equivalent to what American soldiers received. Several prisoners from the camp had been hospitalized for various conditions and had returned recovered, full of stories about American medical facilities and capabilities. The recreation area included a field for sports, with soccer being the most popular activity and with regular games organized between teams formed by prisoners from different barracks or different regions of Germany. There were also areas with simple exercise equipment, volleyball courts, and spaces where prisoners could simply sit and talk or read. A small library had been established, containing books in German that had been provided through Red Cross channels or that had been donated by German-American organizations sympathetic to prisoners' needs. The books included fiction and non-fiction, classics of German literature and contemporary works, providing mental stimulation and entertainment for prisoners who had access to abundant free time. Educational classes were also organized, taught by prisoners who had been teachers or professors before the war, offering instruction in languages, mathematics, history, and other subjects to prisoners who wanted to continue learning or who hoped to prepare for civilian careers after the war. The work program in the camp was explained by Klaus as he and Müller walked past groups of prisoners engaged in various tasks. Some prisoners worked in the camp kitchen, preparing meals under supervision of American cooks, learning American cooking methods, and working with ingredients and equipment that were superior to what German military kitchens typically had available. Other prisoners worked on camp maintenance, repairing buildings, maintaining grounds, performing cleaning and upkeep tasks that kept the facility functioning. Still, other prisoners were assigned to work outside the camp on nearby farms, helping with agricultural labor during planting and harvest seasons, providing assistance to American farmers who faced labor shortages due to wartime mobilization of American workers into military service or into war industries. The farm work program was governed by Geneva Convention regulations that specified prisoners could be required to work on tasks that didn't directly support the war effort, with agricultural labor being explicitly permitted as non-military work. Prisoners who worked on farms were paid small wages in camp scrip that could be used to purchase items from the camp canteen: cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper, stamps, and other comfort items that supplemented the basic necessities provided by camp authorities. The work was hard, particularly during harvest season when long hours were required to bring in crops before weather turned, but prisoners generally considered farm work preferable to idleness, providing purpose and activity that made time pass more quickly and that generated income for purchasing small luxuries. Klaus himself worked on a nearby farm several days per week, and he described the experience with enthusiasm that surprised Müller. The American farmer who employed Klaus and several other prisoners was named Johnson, owned approximately 600 acres of corn and soybeans, and operated his farm with a level of mechanization that Klaus had never seen in Germany. Johnson owned 3 tractors, a combine for harvesting grain, a mechanical planter, and various other equipment that replaced animal power and manual labor with machine power. Klaus, who had grown up on a small farm in Saxony where his family had used horses for plowing and had harvested grain by hand with scythes and sickles, was amazed by American agricultural technology and by the productivity it enabled. Johnson and 2 hired workers could farm 600 acres effectively, producing yields that would have required dozens of workers using traditional German farming methods. Working on Johnson's farm, Klaus had learned to operate tractors and other machinery, skills that he hoped would be valuable after the war when he returned to Germany. He had observed American farming practices that differed from German methods, the use of hybrid seeds that produced higher yields, the application of commercial fertilizers rather than reliance on manure and crop rotation, the use of pesticides to control insects and disease, the integration of mechanical equipment into every phase of farming, from soil preparation through planting to harvest. Johnson had explained some of these techniques to Klaus through a combination of demonstration and limited German that Johnson had learned from his own grandparents, who had immigrated from Germany in the 1880s. The relationship between Johnson and his prisoner workers was professional and sometimes almost friendly, with Johnson treating the Germans as temporary employees rather than as enemies, sharing coffee and conversation during breaks, paying the wages promised, and occasionally giving prisoners extra food to take back to camp. The American farmer's standard of living had impressed Klaus deeply. Johnson lived in a substantial 2-story house with his wife and 3 children, a house that had electricity, running water, central heating, a telephone, and modern appliances including a refrigerator and an electric stove. The house would have been considered upper middle class or even wealthy in Germany, yet Johnson was a working farmer who earned his living from agriculture, not a landowner who employed others to do farm work while he lived in leisure. Johnson owned a car and a pickup truck, drove to town regularly for supplies and social activities, sent his children to school in good clothes with adequate supplies, and lived with a material comfort that exceeded what most German farmers could imagine. His farm was productive and profitable, generating income that supported a good life for his family while also producing food for American consumers and for American military forces. Klaus's descriptions of Johnson's farm and of American agricultural practices raised uncomfortable questions for Müller about German propaganda claims regarding American efficiency and productivity. If American farms were this mechanized and this productive, if American farmers lived this well while producing abundant food, then clearly American agriculture was not the inefficient system that propaganda had described. The mechanization Klaus described represented massive industrial capacity devoted to manufacturing farm equipment, capacity that exceeded German tractor production by orders of magnitude, the infrastructure that supported American farming, the roads that allowed Johnson to transport his grain to market, the electricity that powered his equipment and his home, the telephone that connected him to suppliers and customers, the schools that educated his children, represented investment and organization that contradicted propaganda claims about American chaos and inefficiency. The evening of Müller's first full day in the camp brought another substantial meal in the mess hall, and afterward prisoners gathered in small groups to talk, to play cards, to read, or to simply sit and watch the sunset over the flat American farmland surrounding the camp. Müller joined a group of prisoners from various parts of Germany who had formed a regular evening discussion circle, men who used this time to debate ideas, to share news from letters they had received, to speculate about the war's progress, and to process the confusing reality of their captivity in a nation that bore little resemblance to the America described by German propaganda. The conversations were careful and guarded at first, as prisoners tested each other's political loyalties and assessed whether it was safe to express doubts about official German narratives. But gradually, as trust developed, the discussions became more frank and more disturbing in their implications. One prisoner, a former university student named Ernst, who had studied economics before being conscripted, raised questions that had been troubling him since arriving in America. If American industrial capacity was as limited and inefficient as propaganda claimed, how was America producing the enormous quantities of ships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, and weapons that were being used on multiple fronts simultaneously? The Allied invasion of North Africa had been supported by massive amounts of equipment, all transported across an ocean that Germany supposedly controlled. American forces were also fighting in the Pacific against Japan, operating across vast distances with complex logistics. Britain was being supplied with American equipment under Lend-Lease agreements. The Soviet Union was receiving American trucks, aircraft, and other supplies that were helping sustain Soviet resistance. Simultaneously, America was feeding and equipping its own rapidly expanding military while also maintaining civilian production of automobiles, tractors, and consumer goods. The scope of production necessary to support all these demands simultaneously suggested industrial capabilities that far exceeded German estimates. Another prisoner, a mechanic named Otto, who had worked in an aircraft factory before the war and who understood industrial production, pointed out that the equipment he had seen in America appeared to be new production, not older stocks being pulled from warehouses or reserve units being mobilized. The trucks transporting prisoners were recent models, built within the past year or two. The aircraft occasionally visible flying over the camp were modern types, not obsolete designs from the 1930s. The camp itself had been constructed recently using standardized building components that suggested mass production of construction materials. Everything indicated that American industry was producing at high rates, turning out equipment and materials in quantities that matched or exceeded German production, despite America's late entry into the war and despite the need to build up military forces from a small peacetime establishment. A former merchant named Heinrich, who had traveled extensively before the war, raised questions about American logistics and organization. The transportation of hundreds of thousands of prisoners from North Africa to camps across the continental United States represented a logistical achievement that required ships, trains, trucks, fuel, food, guards, administrative personnel, and camp facilities, all coordinated effectively across thousands of miles. The prisoner transport system alone, just one small part of America's overall war effort, demonstrated organizational capabilities and resource availability that contradicted propaganda claims about American inefficiency. If America could transport and house prisoners this efficiently while simultaneously moving millions of tons of military supplies overseas and maintaining domestic economic activity, then clearly American logistics and organization were highly effective. The food situation provoked particularly intense discussion because it provided daily, tangible evidence that contradicted propaganda. Every meal in the camp demonstrated that America had adequate food supplies, not just for its own population and military, but even for enemy prisoners who could simply be given minimum rations necessary for survival. The variety and quality of food available suggested agricultural productivity that exceeded German capabilities even before the war, combined with transportation and storage infrastructure that could move food efficiently from farms to consumers. One prisoner calculated roughly that the camp population of approximately 2,000 prisoners was consuming perhaps 6,000 meals daily, meals that included meat, dairy, eggs, fresh vegetables and fruit, bread and dessert. Multiplied across hundreds of POW camps holding hundreds of thousands of prisoners, plus meals for millions of American military personnel, plus food for the entire American civilian population, plus food being shipped to allies, the total food production required was staggering and completely inconsistent with propaganda claims about American agricultural inefficiency. The medical care available to prisoners raised similar questions. The camp clinic had supplies of medications including sulfanilamide and penicillin, antibiotics that were scarce in Germany and that German military medicine used sparingly for the most critical cases. American doctors used these medications routinely for infections that German doctors would have tried to treat with less effective methods due to antibiotic shortages. The casual abundance of advanced medications suggested that American pharmaceutical industry was producing in quantities sufficient to meet all demands without rationing. One prisoner, who had been hospitalized for appendicitis, described the American military hospital where he had been treated. Clean facilities with modern equipment, adequate staff, proper sterilization procedures, post-operative care that included pain medication used generously rather than rationed carefully, and recovery conditions that exceeded what German civilian hospitals had provided, even before the war. As weeks turned into months, and as prisoners became more comfortable discussing their observations frankly, a consensus gradually emerged among thoughtful prisoners that German propaganda about America had been fundamentally false in important ways. America was not on the verge of economic collapse. American industrial production was not inefficient or inadequate. American agriculture was not struggling to feed the population. American logistics were not chaotic or poorly organized. American society was not fracturing from internal divisions. Instead, America appeared to be a nation with enormous economic resources, with highly developed industrial and agricultural capacity, with effective organization and infrastructure, and with a standard of living that exceeded German standards even in peacetime. The implications of this realization were deeply troubling for prisoners who tried to understand how Germany could win a war against such an opponent. The letters that prisoners wrote home to families in Germany became increasingly difficult to compose as prisoners struggled to convey the truth about their situation without either violating censorship rules or without seeming to write obvious propaganda. Müller's letters to his parents and younger sister were carefully worded to communicate indirectly what he couldn't say directly. He wrote that he was healthy and had gained weight since capture, allowing his family to infer that food was adequate. He mentioned that medical care was available and that sick prisoners recovered, suggesting that American medicine was effective. He described the camp's recreational facilities and educational opportunities, indicating that treatment was humane. He mentioned the farm work and the mechanized equipment, providing hints about American agricultural technology. He noted that American cities and farms appeared prosperous when seen from the train, offering observations about American civilian life. His family, reading between the lines of his carefully censored letters, understood that he was doing well, but also understood the larger implications about American capabilities. German authorities faced serious problems with mail from prisoners in America. Censors who reviewed prisoner letters before forwarding them to families found consistent themes that contradicted official propaganda. Prisoners reporting good treatment, adequate food, proper medical care, observations of American prosperity and productivity. Some letters were blocked entirely as being too positive about America and therefore suspected of being written under coercion or as Allied propaganda. But blocking all positive letters would have prevented families from receiving any mail from their relatives in American camps, which would have violated Geneva Convention requirements about prisoner correspondence, and which would have generated domestic criticism of German authorities for preventing families from knowing their loved ones were safe. The compromise solution was to allow some letters through while heavily censoring others, and while issuing statements claiming that prisoners were being forced to write favorably about America. German propaganda attempted to explain away the positive reports from prisoners by claiming that America was using a small number of showcase camps where conditions were deliberately made comfortable so that prisoners would write favorable letters, while most prisoners were actually held in harsh conditions that weren't described in the censored correspondence that reached Germany. Propaganda statements claimed that the good food and medical care described by prisoners were temporary, designed to build prisoners' strength before they were put to work under slave labor conditions in American factories and mines. Some propaganda even suggested that prisoners who wrote too favorably about America were traitors who had been corrupted by enemy propaganda or who hoped to receive favorable treatment by cooperating with their captors. These explanations were necessary for propaganda purposes but were increasingly unconvincing to German civilians who received multiple letters from relatives in American camps, all describing similar conditions over periods of months and years. The cognitive dissonance created by prisoner correspondence became more acute as conditions in Germany deteriorated during 1943 and 1944. Allied bombing of German cities intensified, destroying housing and infrastructure, disrupting production, killing civilians, and forcing millions into homelessness or into makeshift shelters. Food rations in Germany were reduced repeatedly as agricultural production declined due to labor shortages and as transportation systems were damaged by bombing. Consumer goods became increasingly scarce as all production was devoted to military needs. Medical care suffered as medications became scarce, as hospitals were damaged by bombing, and as doctors were conscripted for military service. German civilians endured these hardships while reading letters from relatives in American POW camps who reported adequate food, comfortable housing, good medical care, and humane treatment. The contrast was painful and raised difficult questions about whether Germany could win a war against a nation so wealthy it could treat enemy prisoners better than Germany treated its own civilians. Some families whose sons or husbands were prisoners in America experienced complex emotions about their relatives' situation. Relief that their loved ones were safe and healthy mixed with envy that prisoners in America ate better than families in Germany, with resentment that enemies were being treated well while German civilians suffered, and with growing doubts about the war's justification and likely outcome. These feelings were dangerous to express openly in Nazi Germany, where defeatism was a serious crime, but they spread nonetheless through whispered conversations, through reading between the lines of letters, through observations about the contrast between official propaganda and the reality described by prisoners. The psychological impact of prisoner correspondence on German civilian morale was significant and worried German authorities enough that they increased censorship and increased propaganda efforts to discredit positive reports from American camps. For the prisoners themselves, the months and years in American captivity created their own psychological challenges. The initial relief at surviving the war and being safe from combat, combined with the pleasant surprise of good treatment and adequate supplies, eventually gave way to more complex feelings. Boredom and monotony became problems as the initial novelty of camp life wore off, and as prisoners faced the reality of indefinite confinement with limited purpose or meaning. Homesickness intensified as months stretched into years, and as prisoners wondered whether they would ever see their families again, whether their homes still existed after Allied bombing, whether their relatives had survived the war. Guilt troubled some prisoners who recognized that they were living more comfortably than their families in Germany, that they were safe while their countrymen suffered and died, that they were well fed while their relatives went hungry. The progress of the war, followed through censored news and through rumors and through occasional access to newspapers, created additional psychological stress. As Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1944 and into 1945, as Allied forces invaded France and advanced toward Germany from the west, while Soviet forces advanced from the east, as German cities were systematically destroyed by bombing, prisoners faced the growing certainty that Germany would lose the war. This realization forced prisoners to confront difficult questions about what they had fought for, about whether the Nazi regime's goals had ever been achievable or justifiable, about what kind of Germany would emerge from defeat, and about what their own futures would hold. Some prisoners clung to desperate hopes that secret weapons or miraculous reversals might still save Germany from defeat. Others accepted the inevitable and tried to prepare psychologically for return to a defeated and occupied homeland. The education and training programs in the camps took on increased importance as prisoners realized they would eventually return to civilian life in post-war Germany, and that they needed skills to rebuild their lives and their country. Prisoners who had been students before the war resumed their studies through correspondence courses or through classes taught by fellow prisoners who had been professors. Prisoners who had been workers learned new trades or improved existing skills through vocational training programs. Language classes were popular, with many prisoners learning or improving their English in hope that language skills would be valuable in occupied Germany or might even lead to opportunities to immigrate to America after the war. The American authorities encouraged these educational efforts, believing that educated prisoners would be better equipped to contribute to democratic reconstruction of Germany after Nazi defeat. The final months of the war in early 1945 were particularly difficult for prisoners as news reached the camps about the destruction of German cities, about the desperate final battles, about the discovery of concentration camps and the evidence of Holocaust atrocities, and finally about Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. The revelation of concentration camps and systematic mass murder shocked many prisoners who claimed they had been unaware of the full extent of Nazi crimes, though some prisoners admitted they had known or suspected that terrible things were happening to Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution. The prisoners faced collective shame and guilt over what had been done in Germany's name, over the regime they had served, and over the catastrophic defeat that resulted from aggressive war launched by their government. The American guards and administrators, their attitudes toward prisoners affected by the concentration camp revelations, became noticeably cooler and less sympathetic, even while continuing to provide adequate care and to follow Geneva Convention requirements. Repatriation of prisoners began gradually in late 1945 and continued through 1946, with prisoners being shipped back to Germany in groups, returning to a homeland that had been utterly destroyed and that was occupied by Allied forces. The prisoners left American camps with mixed feelings: relief to finally be going home, apprehension about what they would find there, gratitude for having survived the war in relative safety and comfort, and complex emotions about America itself. They had spent years in a country they had been taught to despise, had been treated humanely by people they had been told were their enemies, and had observed prosperity and capabilities that contradicted everything propaganda had claimed. They returned to Germany carrying not just their personal belongings, but also the knowledge that the world was different from what Nazi ideology had taught them, that Germany had been defeated by nations that were stronger and wealthier than propaganda had admitted, and that rebuilding Germany would require facing hard truths about the past. Müller returned to his village in Bavaria in the autumn of 1946, taking a train from the port of embarkation through a Germany that was barely recognizable. Cities he passed through had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, with bridges knocked down and rail lines repaired only enough to allow minimal traffic. The countryside showed evidence of the war's passage, with burned-out vehicles abandoned by roadsides, with damaged buildings, with fields neglected during the final chaotic months. The people he saw looked thin and exhausted, marked by years of war and deprivation, struggling to survive in the ruins of the defeated Reich. Müller, who had spent 3 years eating well in an American prison camp, felt uncomfortable and guilty about his relative good fortune, about the fact that he had survived the war in better health than he had entered it while his countrymen had endured horrors. His family's farm had survived relatively intact, being in a rural area that had not been a bombing target and that had been overrun quickly by American forces in the final weeks of the war without significant fighting. His parents were alive, though aged and worn by the war years. His sister had survived, though she had lost her husband on the Eastern Front. The farm was operating but barely, lacking equipment, lacking draft animals that had been requisitioned by the military, lacking fertilizer and other supplies, producing only enough to feed the family with little surplus for sale. Müller found work helping with the farm and gradually readjusting to civilian life, but he carried with him the knowledge he had gained in America, the understanding of what modern mechanized agriculture could achieve, the memory of abundance that seemed impossible in the poverty of post-war Germany. In the years after the war, Müller occasionally spoke about his experiences as a prisoner in America, describing the camp conditions, the food, the treatment by American guards, and the observations he had made about American society and economy. His accounts were received with varying reactions. Some Germans refused to believe that prisoners had been treated well, assuming that Müller was exaggerating or that he had been in an exceptional camp. Others believed his accounts but resented them, feeling that prisoners had lived comfortably while civilians suffered. Still others understood the larger implications of what Müller described, recognizing that Germany had fought a war against nations with far greater resources and capabilities than German propaganda had admitted, and that defeat had been inevitable once America's full economic power was mobilized for war. These conversations contributed to the broader German reckoning with the Nazi past and with the catastrophic consequences of aggressive war launched based on ideological fantasies and fundamental misunderstandings about the balance of power in the modern world. The experience of German prisoners in American camps during World War II represented a collision between Nazi propaganda and reality, between ideological claims about American weakness and the actual strength of American industrial civilization. For hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, captivity in America provided first-hand exposure to a society that was fundamentally different from what they had been taught to expect. Wealthier and more productive than propaganda had admitted, organized and effective rather than chaotic and inefficient, and capable of treating even enemies with a level of humanity that contrasted sharply with Nazi practices. The prisoners returned to Germany carrying knowledge that challenged the foundations of Nazi ideology, understanding that the regime had led them into an unwinnable war based on fundamental miscalculations about American capabilities and will. This knowledge, spread through prisoner accounts and through the broader German encounter with American occupation forces after the war, contributed to the transformation of German society and to the eventual emergence of a democratic federal republic that rejected militarism and sought integration with the Western nations that had defeated but then helped rebuild Germany. The shock of discovery experienced by German POWs when they encountered American industrial might represented a personal microcosm of Germany's collective awakening to realities that Nazi ideology had obscured, realities that ultimately determined the war's outcome and shaped the post-war world.